Hello, everyone. So this is the first lecture on the third chapter of sociology, and this chapter is socialization. I like to talk about socialization, or when I make reference to it, as it's the how, it's the way. So in the first chapter, we talked about what sociology was and sort of the way we're going to look at it. In the second chapter, we talk about culture, which is what sociology is about. And then this chapter is sort of the how we carry on or how culture is made. And then in the preceding chapters, we'll talk about some of the specific elements within culture and then how those elements work. So socialization, it sounds on its surface like sort of a taken for granted kind of thing. This is in the great nature nurture debate, this is the nurture. What is different about sociology compared to psychology is psychology focuses a lot more, a lot more on the nature, on the structure, on the brain, on the biology. And sociology, we're going to just kind of completely dismiss all of that, and we're going to focus on the nurture. We're going to talk about the environment, the roles of other people, the way, this again, going back to this idea that there's no such thing as the individual. There's no such thing as the individual because we all are exposed to the same social forces, right? And while you may be in Salina and I may be in Manhattan, we're still exposed to the social forces of our American political system, of what the world looks like in 2021, of a Christian culture. So we may have slightly different experiences, but overall we're very similar. In some of the patterns assignments, I've had many students make those observations that we're more alike than we are different, and there's a lot of truth to that. But the challenge is also looking really closely, right? Looking really closely. Okay, so sociology is the nurture. It is the process. It is the verb. Sometimes I'll ask that on a quiz question. Is it a noun or a verb? It's an ongoing, never-ending process of becoming or changing. If you take human growth and development, we talk a lot about socialization. This is the idea that the socialization process interconnects generations. And what that means is, like, it's your parents' generation that socializes you, or maybe your grandparents, or your grandparents socialized your parents, and then your parents socialized you, and then you're going to socialize your children. And so there's an important idea in sociology, and it's right here on this slide, it's right here: social reproduction. And social reproduction is a really important term. And what this means is that we replicate society the way that, and again, this is patterns. This is not every single specific individual, but the general pattern is, for instance, that if you grow up in a home where people went to college, you'll probably go to college. If you grow up in a home where, here's some other patterns that get socially reproduced: people's political identities, right? So if you grow up in a home where people are pretty conservative, you're more likely to be politically conservative than you are to be liberal. If you grow up in a home where your parents are military, you're more likely to be military. Now again, these are the patterns, right? We're not talking about every single person. A divorce is another one, what the data tells us, right? What the patterns tell us is that if you grow up in a household where your parents are divorced, you're more likely to end up being divorced. This is the social reproduction. This is the reason, oh my goodness gracious, I don't have any more pieces of paper. But this is the reason that this particular shape doesn't really change from generation to generation. This is the shape of society. There may be some variation, right? There may be a fewer people in the middle, and maybe the top gets a little further away or the bottom gets a little fatter, but it doesn't go from a triangle to a square or a triangle to a circle. That because your social location, where you're born, right? The kinds of jobs you have, your relative place, how many people below you are poor, how many people above you are wealthy, that is going to be passed on to the next generation. If your parents are teachers and you become a teacher, your relative rank or your relative location is going to stay the same. right? And again, this is not true with every single person, but the general pattern is that you're going to stay in your social class, right? And then, of course, other sort of more personal patterns also get passed on. So it's the passing on of a culture. It's the passing on, and there are some changes. Yeah, there's always going to be that intergenerational disagreement, but overall, they're not radical changes. They're minor changes that take multiple generations to really be significantly different. Okay, so it connects one generation. Oh, socialization is the process of learning about your groups, right? So one of the significant groups that we will talk about in this chapter, yes, and in another, is the group of gender, right? You learn through the process of influences by your parents, your church, your religion, your peers, your school, all of that. You learn what does it mean to be a boy or a girl, and how are boys and girls supposed to act, right? So you learn about that it's appropriate to wear this and not to wear that. We're told that big girls do this or big boys do this, or we're told big boys don't do that, right? You're told to cry or be polite or all of these things, act like a lady or act like a big boy, whatever. But the point is that this is the process of how we learn about our group. You may also have very explicit lessons in how you're supposed to be as a child, right? I think of an example of my father used to say, he would tell me, he said explicitly what my rank in the family was. And that because I was the child and he was the adult, I was supposed to do as he said. That's socialization. That is learning about your place in your group, right? Part of learning about our place in our group is learning how to be. You remember chapter 2, we were talking about culture and how we be. Part of how we be, part of how we are, is how we express ourselves and how we interact. So one thing we'll talk about in this chapter is called the socialization of emotions. And it's not the best phrase, but it's the idea that the way that we um, respond, the way that we the way that we emote, the way that we express, even the way that we're allowed to feel in our culture, that those are decided by society, right? In our society, going back to the last chapter when we were talking about language, right? That our language gives us words that we associate with emotions, and then we are allowed to express. So when the kindergarten teacher says, I don't know who's out there necessarily in cyberspace, but when the kindergarten teacher says, Sarah, I know you're mad, but you don't hit Tommy. She is socializing. She is teaching me, she is teaching Sarah what my feeling is. She's giving me a word for my feeling, and she is telling me how I'm supposed to be, how I am supposed to act, right? And she's also telling me, like, or if you hear things like, you shouldn't feel that way, which, by the way, in psych, I would say no one should ever tell you how you shouldn't feel. Your feelings are yours. But our culture has, going back to chapter 2, our culture has ideas about what is an acceptable emotion and what's an acceptable feeling, what's a non-acceptable acceptable feeling. And we are socialized from an early age that certain emotions, certain ways of expressing, certain ways of being are okay and desirable and appropriate, and others are not. That there are rules for how we are allowed to feel and how we are allowed to emote that feeling. And when you violate them, that's the next chapter on deviance, when you break the norms of emotional expression, this triggers, right? Well, this can trigger a police investigation. If you go to your wife's funeral and you don't cry, right? Well, then you must have killed her, because it's a sign, it's an indication that you are not appropriately socialized. It's an indication that something is not right with you. And again, I want to emphasize that from a sociological perspective, these are all cultural rules, right? Society decides. These are called social constructs. Society decides what is acceptable and what is not. Okay, so socialization is effectively how these structures of society, how they become part of our identity, right? It is the process, it connects generations, it's how we learn what's appropriate for our placement in society, for being a boy, a girl, a child, a teacher, a parent, poor, rich, whatever, and it's passed along from generations. It often results in a very similar place as the generations before us. That's social reproduction. We repeat it, we pass it on, and it includes how we express and how we emote. I'm going to stop this video right here.